Good afternoon and welcome to the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC's February webinar. I'm just going to share my screen here and we'll get going. All right. My name is Ryan Stewart and I am facilitating today's webinar. Thanks for being here. I'd like to acknowledge that I am grateful to live, work, and play on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. During last month's webinar, we had the topic was on reconciliation. We had two panelists who suggested that land acknowledgements needed to be more than just an agenda item. So in the spirit of that, for today's webinar, I'm going to make a donation to the Indigenous Women Outdoors. They are a group that in the Sea to Sky region that works to introduce Indigenous women to adventure sports like hiking, mountain biking, rock climbing, ski touring. And their goal is not just to diversify the outdoors, it's to mentor Indigenous women to become guides, instructors, and leaders in these sports. You can learn more about the organization at indigenouswomenoutdoors.ca. A little housekeeping before we get going. We're recording this webinar. We'll be sharing the recording with you later this week, along with key takeaways, action items, and links to resources. We'll start with the presentation from our guest, followed by questions and answers session, and we'll wrap up around 2 o'clock. If you have any questions during the webinar, pop them in the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen. Someone might answer them directly during the guests during the conversation, or we'll pose them to our guests during the Q&A session. Immediately following the webinar, we have a super short survey. Please stick around and take it. It helps us do a better job with these and cover topics that you want to learn about. All right, so today's webinar is part of a monthly series hosted by the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC. The ORCBC is the only united voice for the outdoor recreation community in BC. It represents nearly 100 nonprofit organizations and about 100,000 British Columbians. It's a diverse bunch: anglers, dirt bikers, bird watchers, rock climbers. Their different passions merge with a shared love of the outdoors and an interest in how the lands and waters are managed, which is the topic of today's webinar. So a lot has changed with the provincial government and how it manages the use of land and water, especially in the last few years. And it's been everything from developing a new land use planning process, there are commitments to biodiversity and ecosystem health, and there's the Declaration Act, which formally adopted the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. It has prompted changes to the Forest and Range Practice Act, and just recently the proposed changes to the Land Act. All these changes reflect a shift in landscape planning and management. Today's guest, Garry Merkel, has called for this paradigm shift when he co-authored the Old Growth Strategic Review. Now, Garry is a member of the Tahltan Nation and a registered professional forester. He started in forestry in the Yukon in the late 1980s. At the time, he was one of only a couple Indigenous people employed in resource planning in the entire country. Today, he lives near Kimberley and advises the provincial government, stakeholders, and First Nations on implementing all these changes going on with landscape planning and management. He has a uniquely holistic understanding of the forces driving these changes and what they mean to the ecosystems and the recreation community. So I'm going to stop sharing there and hand over to Garry to take us away and tell us a little bit more about what's going on and how he's involved.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan. Hello, everybody. It's good to see you all. I'm going to put up a presentation in a sec here. Um, I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me. I don't know how many people are out there because the only person I see is Ryan, but I suspect there's a couple of you out there. And I probably know lots of you, I'm sure, since we all kind of live and recreate on the same land base and live in the same circles a lot. I am joining you, as Ryan said. I'm actually at home right now. I'm at home in, it says you have video but no sound. I don't know who that is, but you got sound, right, Ryan?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm good too. So they'll figure it out. Anyways, yeah, awesome. Yeah, some people say they can hear, and some people saying hi that I know. Hi, guys. Anyways, I'm joining you from home, just outside of Kimberley. I live on a little lake called St. Mary's in the bush here. We live off the grid. In theory, that's supposed to be greener, but it's not, because you got to have generators and batteries and all kinds of other stuff that kills elephants and everything else. So, um, I'm going to talk today, and I'll just start this presentation. I'll try to get it over with in less than half an hour for sure. So we get lots of time to talk and maybe even quicker. It's just a lot of ground to cover, but I'll skip a lot of the little stuff. Um, okay, to start with, some of you have heard this, so you can giggle or not, but Nadit Denasa Uche, that means that my Tahltan name is Nadit Denasa, which means strong man. But I tell all my friends, smell isn't everything. So um, we're going to talk today about how the way we look at and the way we approach land stewardship. Land stewardship is kind of your ethical approach to how you manage land. Manage means the actual physical activity. And our whole ethical approach to land is shifting right now, our paradigm, the way we think about land. And our whole management system is shifting to also move with this. But it we're not the only ones in the world going through this. There's numerous other countries going through this, and I just had a really interesting call with European Union this morning because they're trying to figure out exactly the same thing. And I've talked to numerous other countries now who are really going through a very similar transformation and try to rethink their relationship to land and how we can look after it better. And this is a this is a game where you don't really know what the rules are. You know how to behave, which we in theory do, but we don't do very well. But you don't know the rules and you're kind of making them up as you go along. But what we do know is that if we live with it right, it'll look after itself and it'll look after us. That's what we do know for sure. And the exact opposite is true. If you don't look after it, it'll kill you. It's real simple. And you conduct that for as long as you try, but I don't know anybody who's won that battle yet. So a little bit about where we're at and this whole change that we're seeing right now. We are going through what I'd characterize as three major shifts in the way our land stewardship right now. The first is that we are moving from a model of consultation and accommodation and a rights-based type model, obligations type model with First Nations to much more of a let's do this together kind of model and let's work together kind of model, ultimately potentially evolving to some kind of collaborative management and governance framework. Secondly, we are moving from a much more centralized decision-making model to much more regionally and ecologically based model. The principle behind that, and with informed and active participation of the local people in those areas. The principles behind these two movements are that right now we manage ecosystems, thousands of year-old ecosystems on a 4-year political cycle, and it flips around with the whims of every cycle and it just it drives us to the bottom in the end is what it ends up doing. And so the thinking is if you can change your rudder to something much more stable and grounded in land to where the impacts are directly felt, maybe we can get some stability in the system over time. And finally, we are shifting our management emphasis from a management style that focuses on what can we take in terms of resources and deal with some constraints like, I'll cut this big area and I'll leave a couple patches for wildlife and stuff like that, that kind of thinking, to a system that says, no, we are going to look after the integrity of the land base, the ecological health, and the biodiversity of the landscape. And then it will take care of itself and we'll take what it can give us. And that will be our overarching priority, not just for forestry it's for all sectors, because the land doesn't care whether you're doing a clear cut or a pasture or a highway or a ski resort or whatever. It's all the same in the end. Every one of these changes requires a huge change in the way we think, our paradigm. When we did the review, we found public is really universally right across the board. Everybody said we got to change the way we're doing this. It's just not working for anybody. And the Indigenous population is certainly pushing this envelope. We saw many, many submissions by various sectors that said the costs to us are huge. And frankly, if you add them all up, pale what we're gaining from the heavy resource extraction, particularly forestry sector. But we don't do that kind of math in this province. We do kind of one-dimensional math. Our species loss is starting to matter. Maybe it wasn't so bad when we lost a couple little owls and, caribou, yeah, that kind of sucks. But now we're starting to lose moose, and that's really starting to hit home and things like that. And that's really starting to matter to a lot of people in a lot of places. We had a bunch of previous strategies that just weren't implemented properly, all of which could have put us in a much better place if we had of. And one of our core issues is because we've been managing for resources for so long now, with this focus on resource use subject to constraints, we have very few managers right now who know how to manage for ecological health and biodiversity and that type of thing. That doesn't mean we can't learn it, and doesn't mean that we don't have the fundamentals, but we don't have the experience. And frankly, there's other jurisdictions out there now who are, some of them are as many as 30 years into this, and they're still learning, but we can learn lots from them. I'm not going to go through this a whole bunch, but we have a lot of things in our way right now. I'm just going to spend a minute or two on it, particularly this. I talked about understanding. We certainly, government, for some reason, we all feel, I don't know what it is. I think it's a result of the partisan politics system where it's acceptable that government's always a lightning rod and we can blame them for everything when all they are is just a collection of individuals, just like us, who know maybe more than us in some ways because they're doing the job and they're trying to think it through. But they aren't born with infinite wisdom either. And so they're learning as we go and moving into this new thing. And they're struggling with how do we do this in the best way possible and take care of as many people as we can as we move through this process. But they're a very siloed and fractured environment that is very difficult. People don't talk to each other very well in there. So trying to rise this up a level and say, okay, let's start looking at land as a whole now and stop just focusing on that mushroom over here and then this frog way over here and this fish way over here and not connecting them together is a difficult thing to do when you go across boundaries. But probably some of the hardest things we have to deal with are really more about the way we've set up this system or the way it's turned out. We have a very deeply rooted bias towards timber in this province, a lot like Alberta does with its oil and gas, because this is our culture. We built it on the backs of that. And it trumps a lot of everything. And we have a very deeply entrenched idea that everybody else is the enemy and we're in the right. And that behavior plays out in public all the time. And we have a lot of mistrust between Indigenous governments and provincial governments in particular because of this legalistic positional relationship that we've had for a long time. And we're working through that and getting over it, but it's still there and the remnants are there. And what we also have is a lot of remnants of this idea that we can just trade off things in the land. You know, it's okay to kind of destroy the ecological integrity of this area because we've saved this other piece way over here somewhere. So, you know, we've saved the tops of a bunch of mountains, so we can do what we want on the rest of it. And that land doesn't work like that. Land doesn't work like that at all. But that mentality is still there. And so working through this, a little bit difficult. Um, so I'm just quickly going to talk about a bunch of there's a lot of different initiatives you hear going on out there. The Old Growth Review, Together for Wildlife, Watershed Security Strategy, Modernized Land Use Planning, the Forest and Landscape Plans, all that other stuff. They're all kinds of stuff, and they all are trying to be consistent with the principles of DRIPA. They all are trying to prioritize ecosystem health and biodiversity, but they're all kind of seem like they're hanging in space and they don't make sense. And frankly, at this moment in our history, I don't know for sure that they do make a lot of sense, but we are trying to make sense out of them. And Walrus was created, the Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship Ministry. Its job is to figure out how do we build this how do we make the conservation and management of ecosystem health and biodiversity a priority across this province, a legislative priority? How do we move towards this much more collaborative co-management relationship between Indigenous governments and coordinate that at a regional and provincial scale, move it up beyond just the local scale so we can deal with provincial policy and regional planning in a way that brings people together as opposed to having to work with 200 different groups and try to sort out stuff between them. And how do we pull all of this together into a comprehensive whole land planning framework? So this is a whole land approach and actually a whole of society approach is required to make this kind of a shift. Ultimately, we would expect to have some kind of future land governance system that, of course, retains provincial cabinet, but under that has some kind of co-governance, G to G type relationship and integrating regional planning bodies with significant authority and planning function, which guides all local operations. And that system would ideally see the land as a whole. It would include all sectors. It would maintain ecosystem health, prioritize ecosystem health and biodiversity. It would create a stable flow of resources because healthy ecosystems can provide that. And it, of course, requires a whole bunch of retooling in the system itself to actually make this work. So all these different initiatives here, these all will be merged into this stewardship system through this comprehensive planning framework. And so Walrus will design this governance and this stewardship system, and all of these initiatives are helping to inform this design. This is something I don't believe we're communicating that well, and this governance system would govern this stewardship system. I think we need to communicate this better, obviously, because it is a dream, certainly, that makes a lot of sense when you think about it for a little while. But the transition of moving from here to there, not so easy. We definitely have to change the way we think. Changes in thinking at this scale require you and I as individuals to change our thinking, and then groups like yourselves can maybe change thinking, and then ultimately that change in thinking, the change in the paradigm, which is really how you think, happens to everybody. And that happens because we develop a new language that describes this new approach. We build structures that reflect this approach. We create education and teach people and learn about it and understand it and have our input into it. And we celebrate as we move along this path that, wow, we're starting to achieve this. We're starting to get stable economies. We're starting to get clean water everywhere. We're starting to see populations of things that we care about starting to come back now. And we're starting to see our wildfire resistance reduce at the landscape level. But the important part of this is this all starts in your mind. It starts with your thinking, and that thinking ultimately translates into ideas and plans, into action, but it all starts in your mind. I'm not going to go through this. The important part of this is in this shift, the early shifts we're trying to facilitate in the governments and the forest sector, because it is the sector that is leading with forest landscape plans. Those are some of the more, but also we have modernized land use plannings, which are at various stages, watershed security plans, which are going to have to start integrating some of this thinking. And so ultimately we are expanding to other sectors and then society at large. And that's the point of this diagram. If the leaders don't get it and they totally don't understand it and can lead it, then you can't, but you need somebody to do it. And that really is the forest sector now, largely through implementation of the Old Growth Action Plan, which is expected to be announced very shortly. We shift our thinking from this idea that we own everything and we can do whatever we want with it to the fact that we are owned, and that we can take whatever we want and get more all the time to more, what can it give us? We keep looking to others for answers when this is actually a collective wisdom process, especially for people who know and live on and understand land. We have this idea that forests are somehow the center of everything, when frankly, forests are just the product of healthy ecosystems. And we have this idea that this is all about economic growth and getting more, and it is in a way, but it is more about getting stable, predictable, and reliable resource flows to support that, and living with those and learning how to use those better and getting more value out of them and more value staying in this province. That's what it's about. I'm not going to go through this, but the bottom line of this is Indigenous, there's a lot of Indigenous plans that are starting to be built now and implemented that think like this, and they all have to figure out how to mesh those with our historic planning. So someday, maybe someday, we get to this place where we've achieved a level of land stewardship where we have restored and ecosystem health and biodiversity right across this province, and get a stable flow of resources that can provide a solid, stable base for an economy. And this whole approach is broadly understood, supported by, and meaningfully involves the broader public. We've actually risen above the need to. We look after the land as a whole, and we can trust ourselves. We've risen above the need to have to put little bubbles over areas because we're looking after it all right. And this is all done under this provincial Indigenous co-governance umbrella. But the job right now we need to preserve options because we can't trust ourselves to look after things until we get here. And we need to support the transition to here. That's just the way it is. This diagram, I won't go through it in detail, but really what it says is you don't start at co-governance. Building government, and especially co-governance, means formal sharing of decision-making and accountability. It means you are bound by all of the administrative law, bound by public expectation around input and involvement. You are bound by all the same rules and have to live by those. And if you don't, you can be taken to court, and your decisions can be questioned and overridden, just the same as any other government. To get here, you have to do a lot of work as two governments to get to that ability, and then two governments together to be able to do that. And we are way back into doing a lot of joint projects with some small co-management things going on here and here, and we're a ways away from doing this. When you manage for ecosystem health, you have to learn how to think like an ecosystem. I want to get down to the land now. All that transition stuff's great, but let's talk about land and what it means to recreation. You have to start thinking about ecosystems. Ecosystems don't operate on the same time frames as trees. They operate on much longer time frames. Even a boreal ecosystem, a lot of you are from there, you've at the most find 250, 300-year-old trees, except for in a black spruce swamp, you can find way older stuff, but mostly that's the oldest. But those ecosystems, many of them are a few thousand years old, and they take at least some of them 1,000 years to develop. A coastal ecosystem can take a few thousand years to develop into that system that can actually support that whole mesh of life, web of life on top of it, the trees and all the rest of the stuff. And so when you manage for this, you have to think about the integrity of it. What are the pieces? What are the relationships? What are the functions and processes? And how is it connected across a landscape? How do I keep the pieces, and how do I keep them functioning? How do I do that locally and at a landscape level? And how do I keep particularly a significant part of the old parts of those ecosystems intact, spread across a landscape? In any mature, healthy ecosystem anywhere in the world, whether it be aquatic or grassland or forest, any kind of terrestrial, has a significant component of old, and that old is the cornerstone or anchor for the rest of that ecosystem, the health of it. You have to think about even though it's old, it varies a lot, and we call that the natural range of variation, or the historic range. It gets, things come and go, but you have to think about that and kind of try to stay within that to keep the landscape healthy. And connectivity, but you really also have to think about human impacts and some special management areas. Like, once you've kind of managed ecosystem, you also think about special management like cultural areas and stuff. And I want to talk about this human impact. Access, for example. And access is when large mammals require a whole mix of things. Most of you will know this, all of you know this. They need birthing areas, denning areas, calving areas, feeding areas, child rearing, breeding, etc. They have all these different areas on a landscape, and they're all reasonably connected within an area, and they know where they are, and they may have some alternatives if something happens to one. But they don't, once you start putting too much access into an area, they will stop having those, and they will stop getting to them. And there's a lot of other pressures start to happen as well. Some research out of UMBC recently was showing that the magic number for major mammal populations is around 0.6 kilometers per square kilometer. If you start going over that, you are going to see major declines in large mammal populations. And we are seeing a significant decline in moose across the entire central BC. And we have road densities in some areas approaching 5 kilometers per square kilometer, which seems crazy to me. How do you do that? And this counts little roads and big roads. Caribou, much more sensitive, like 0.2, 0.1. We also see impacts in ecosystems just from this quiet enjoyment factor. There's some research out of CFS that shows that within a kilometer of road, you see changes in the ecosystem functioning and patterns, and mammal patterns and use a good kilometer away from any road. And with air traffic, especially like with goats now, I think the recommendation is at least 2 kilometers away for air traffic. And We have a valley up where I come from where the goats have left because it was a throughway back into exploration area, and all the goats have gone now once they started using it for that. And it's a big valley. So, so we do certainly have to think about these kinds of things. And then old growth. Old growth, as I said, is a cornerstone for ecological health on a landscape. But it needs to be functioning. It needs to have its pieces and parts, and it needs to do what it does as an old area. But when you make an edge on an old growth area, old forest, it has an effect, an average of about 100 meters in, and it can be longer. It can be quite a bit longer depending on topography and stuff, where the whole functioning and species mix, a bunch of species disappear and functioning changes and simplifies from that edge. And so we've done some analysis on a couple TSAs where we looked at this edge effect and found that we had 0% effective old growth. We had no effective old growth left in those TSAs because of the layout of the old growth patterns in those areas. Our harvesting profile, we want to pay attention to, as I've mentioned a few times, this old growth is a cornerstone, but there's a rule of thumb supported by quite a bit of literature and practice now. It's not exact, but if you keep about 70% of your old growth, inherently occurring old growth, you will have no material effect on biodiversity. But if it starts to drop down to 30% or less of what would have been there historically, you're in a very high risk and will start losing for sure sensitive populations and likely start to lose other populations and see significant reductions in biodiversity. We certainly see overharvest in some areas of mammals. We see this in where I come from, including poaching, because I guess we're all a little desperate these days. And we certainly see some significant impacts on sustenance harvesting in some areas now in the province where the local tribes are unable to do this because there's just nothing left. And this is like cumulative effects of blueberry decision. We recently had a court case that said you have to think about the accumulation of your effects. If this causes this kind of problem, it actually sets the provincial government up for a lawsuit and damages for loss of this if you could have done something about it and people were talking to you about it ahead of time. And in many of these cases, that has been happening. I think I'm going to just skip this other stuff here because I really want to talk about this. When you manage for ecosystem health, your planning approaches change. You start to look at the landscape as a whole. You do what we call total chance planning. You think about how do I access the whole thing? And you tend to do it in big chunks and you try to leave the land heal as much as it can between chunks. And you think about what do I want to leave there so that it can bring itself back and restore itself as quickly as possible. And then I move over and do another big chunk. It's not the current pattern we have now of little wee dots everywhere like measles on a landscape. That actually turns out to be very unhealthy for a landscape, that style of management. And so that's what this means now. Big chunks, do a whole range of various treatments, try to leave the landscape very diverse and able to recover reasonably quickly, move to another area, close everything off over here as much as you can after you've finished doing it and keep doing that. What that ultimately means is you see reduced motorized access and over the whole landscape. And it's going to take a lot more effort to actually go out and get your animals, which, hunting purists like that. I felt a little guilty when I went hunting first time on a quad. I thought, shit, this is way too easy. Anybody could do this. But it also means that you really have to learn a lot more about and getting a lot more involved in land stewardship if this system is set up properly. And it also means much more stable resource flows, whether that's moose or trees or whatever. So for you, as individuals, I would suggest that you get involved with all this stuff as it's implemented. The biodiversity and ecosystem health framework in particular is going to try to figure out how do we build this holistic planning framework and how do we engage regional parties in managing their own areas and support them and learn how to think like ecosystems and plan like ecosystems for those of you who have a bent to do that. Talk regularly about this with your counterparts. Let's change our beer conversations from how many moose can we kill to how can we make more moose on the landscape? I mean, I still like to talk about how many moose I get too. Don't get me wrong, because I like moose and that's what the way you talk. And you start with the land and you figure out, okay, what's right for that? And now how do I move through the transition to get to there? And how do I take care of as many people as I can and involve them and figure this out together? Because this really is about wisdom when you manage like this. It's not science and technology are important, but wisdom is critical. First Nations have a lot of really good ideas and thinking on this, but we as collectively as a society, and particularly in British Columbia, we have a lot of built-in biases that we need to overcome and really question the way we think. We have some God-given right to do this. And yeah, I guess, you can do it. Of course you can do it. But there always are consequences. And it'd be really nice in the interim because we have a whole set of laws and legislation built on this kind of old thinking, and we're trying to move to this new thinking, and we're in this gap right now. We need some guidance in the interim, some outcomes of what are we trying to get to, and longer term outcomes, of course. And that really is critical that we get that sooner than later. If you look after the ecosystem, you get this way more sustainable thinking. You support conditions that support everything, including you. You create landscapes that are way more resilient and resistant to major catastrophic events. You cater to public sensibilities. You reduce your impacts to other sectors, and you do provide for truly sustainable benefits. This is a huge change. It's transformative. But we're like half a generation into it now, maybe a generation. I think it's at least a couple, 3 generations for us to fully realize this shift and move through this transition if we do it right and if we engage people properly. Um, and it certainly it requires us to work together, collective wisdom and ownership. And that's as far as I think I want to go in terms of talking. I know that's a lot of stuff, but I just want to get it on the table and we can go from there. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, Gary. Appreciate that. Let's get to some questions then. Maybe you can start off by giving us a little bit of a sense of, some people have wondered why. Why do we need to make this shift? So can you kind of sum that up into like a really clear, like what is the why and why now?
Yep. No, I can do that. Well, let's just start with the why is when we did the old growth review, I expected to hear a lot of people say, we're fine, leave it alone. We heard like 2 people out of the thousands that we talked to who said, you guys, this is all crap. We're doing fine. Everybody else said, we need to change this. We're not doing this right. So, you know what? I know that's a bit subjective. But the point being is that right now, we are compromising. If we do a measure of ecosystem health across this province, the health of all those ecosystems are very low. We are way outside of what we call the natural range or historic range of variability. We are starting to see major mammal populations decline and collapse. We are seeing major catastrophic wildfire happening across the landscape. Part of that is due to climate change because it helps with fire starts and helps dry it out. But without that kind of diverse, burnt regularly landscape, it takes off and goes forever. We also are seeing water supplies being compromised significantly in different areas where we're developing. That part of that is unavoidable, unfortunately, with climate change. There is going to be water issues regardless. We did a thing in the Columbia Basin here that showed us that. Um, this model, maybe the bottom line why is this model that we're working with is unsustainable in the long term. And we're leaving our kids a really ugly mess to clean up that we already have inherited a really ugly mess. For those of us who know how to do this work, we are in a situation where we're in a tough situation, and at least in the forest sector for sure. And it has to be fixed. If you, I mean, but you know what? We could just keep the whole land base open and just let everybody go over it like ants everywhere if we don't care about the rest of the things that are on it, because they'll just go away. That's the other choice. So, you know, I don't know about you, but I don't like that choice.
Yeah, no, I definitely don't like that choice either. And then from a recreational perspective, I mean, you mentioned, you know, the access to the to land. I mean, how do you see that playing out? Do you see? I think when we talked before, you talked about kind of seasonal closures, maybe fewer access roads into the backcountry. Is that the sort of stuff we're going to see as a recreation sector when all of this
Um,
sort of plays out?
yes, in the boreal forest, that is certainly, and interior, a lot of the interiors, that's how it plays out if you manage this way. Um, you see areas being closed off more and less access into backcountry. You know, Montana, I'll tell you a little story about Montana decided they wanted to save the caribou, so they just shut the backcountry to motorized recreation. And they managed to do it way longer than we did. We didn't do any of that, and ours are gone now for and through most of the province, and the others are quite a few of the others are walking dead right now. Um, and so, yes, that's what that means. It means um, less motorized access to the landscape. Uh, so that means, I guess, maybe those of us who want to get way back up in there into areas that aren't going to be open all the time, is that maybe we all go back to horses or walking or stuff like that. And I know that sucks for a lot of people, and they go, you know, I don't want that. I want to get back there. And so do I, believe me. After hunting on a quad and going up, you know, I get up in the morning, I drive to the top of the mountain, I scope around, I go and see something, I go and get it and come back, and I can be laying on my bunk by 5 or something. I kind of like that. But in the bigger scheme of things, for me, I think about, well, if I do that and every other 1,000 of my buddies do that, we're not going to be able to go up there and see anything anymore because they're all gone. Do I want that? No, not at all. I don't want that. So I don't know. It's a personal choice, right? But that's the way it is.
Um, so we have a question here. How does Walrus design the system when the BC government is so entrenched in the colonial systems and thinking? Is there an Indigenous group that is guiding and mentoring the government staff through this shift?
Um, me, for one, my role in this whole thing is I'm actually an independent mentor and coach and facilitator and advisor, not just for government, but for all of us to try to, you know, I don't have all the answers. I'm trying to help, but we also rely heavily on the First Nations Forestry Council and a few of the other First Nations sectoral councils who've been trying to promote and use other forms of management based on this kind of thinking for some time. And there are some really good models out there that we can build off of that show us that we can build solid economic models off these things if you do them right. Um, so yes is the short answer. Is there enough? I don't know. I mean, just because you got a brown face doesn't mean you know how to think like this. And just because you don't have a brown face doesn't mean that you don't know how to think like this. So it's not, it's kind of about your color of your skin, but it's also not about totally about the color of your skin. So we got to acknowledge that too. So I characterize it more as this kind of way of thinking that's very powerful and useful for all of us, frankly.
And um, is there any support for capacity with First Nations when it comes to this, and or
Yes.
recreation groups and others to when they try and get involved in these things?
Yes to First Nations. Right now, government Walrus has a significant budget to figure out how to build these multi-party planning, and we are talking about how do we build some larger public education around how do ecosystems work and how do we plan and live with them properly and all of that kind of stuff. Um, I'll tell you, maybe I'm kind of dealing a bit because I know there's people out there who are afraid. And it's the interesting thing that I've found through this is if you can learn about this and you can understand it, and you start to see some of the models that are being built, and you go, holy crap, that's not so bad. Actually, it's really good in a lot of ways because it's so stable and it's giving me all these things I want. Now, it's true that I can't keep the economy that I just built that's beyond the ability of the land to provide in some areas. But when I make it that transition, I get to this other place, I'm getting all this other stuff that I always wanted, and I'm way happier and I feel way better about it. And it's not that boogeyman in the closet that I thought it was. It doesn't shut everything down. It doesn't do any of that. But you'd sure think that by listening to, the political people. It's not true at all. It's just I'm always amused, I guess, by the politics of this kind of thing. So yes, we've been certainly talking about how do we help people understand this better? How do you build planning frameworks that can involve people more? Or I've been involved in those kinds of conversations. How do we create outreach properly to properly engage people? Because we're not talking about planning anymore. Okay, I'll give you those trees if you give me my cows. Or like it's not that kind of planning at all. It's about what does the land need? How do we take care of it? And then and can we adjust that to get a few more of some other things? Yeah, that's okay. But the first priority, take care of it. And that's most of the conversation to start with.
Um, we have a question here and a couple sort of related to this, sort of talking about those cumulative effects and recreation. How do you see that playing out with even non-motorized recreation, even like do you see that being an issue where we start seeing trail closures and things like that, to like they did in Montana there, or where they do some closures now for caribou with different motorized groups as well?
I suspect we're going to see some access restrictions for motorized for sure. Um, That's always such a sensitive subject. I'm going to stop this sharing here so I can be bigger on the screen. That's always such a sensitive subject, right? Because but I got to tell you, I'm going to just tell you a little story. We have a problem with caribou in our area. We were losing them, right? And we still have problems with caribou. And the three tribes came together, and we have a biologist who is a mixture. I come from Tahltan. He's a mixture of Tahltan and Tlingit. We're basically adjacent and share some areas with Casca as well, the three of us. And what he came and he looked at it a bit and went out with the old people, and he said the problem is there's two problems. One is that we've got too much access into the high country and we're using it at the wrong times. And secondly, we're taking too many animals. So he says, if you care about the caribou, stop hunting them for a while and stop going in there in all these times and stuff. And you know what? Except for a couple assholes, everybody did it. And those assholes got dealt with by the rest of the community. I mean, you have to decide what you care about, right? But the problem sometimes is you got people who make these laws who don't know. And that becomes a problem, of course, because they start making stupid laws. And then everybody goes, well, those guys are idiots. They don't know what they're talking about. So it kind of, it's a bit of a delicate balancing act. That's all I can say about that. Yeah. But we got to work through it. We really do.
Well, on that note, I mean, do you see anything changing if we have a change in government?
Um, I guess it depends on why they get voted in. Almost every time we vote in a government, it's because we've finally been convinced that the other guys are assholes and these guys need to go. And we got to do everything exactly the opposite of what that other government did. I mean, that's the nature of our system, right? It's not because you're smarter and better. It's because those guys were so bad. We're going to do everything completely different. And so what happens? This is the way it works over time. And I've watched this cycle now quite a few times in this province. We build up to that point, and the next government comes in with a completely, that's all crap mandate, and we're going back to a full extraction and opening up the country and building the economy and all that stuff. And they start taking all those resources. The problem is we say things like old growth, for example, are a renewable resource. They're not. You're not, you cannot grow old ecosystems. They take too long. If you harvest them right and keep enough of the ecological integrity so that they can grow back and heal themselves, you can. But the way we're doing it with the large scale clear cuts, you knock them back a few thousand years in time in terms of their ecological development. So yeah, you can grow some trees again, but it's never that kind of robust, healthy, biodiverse system. And if you do that at a big enough scale, now I'm starting to see whole landscapes become simplified, more susceptible to disease, producing less cover, doing all kinds of things that are not healthy for us. And that accumulates over time. So we start fixing it, we get a little better, we might restore a couple of ecosystems, get it here, and we knock it down again. And then we start from there again, but it always is going down. That's the issue with that. So under this system, I'm not 100% sure. That's why I personally believe in changing the rudder.
Mhm.
I, you know what, we don't elect in our communities when we have this conversation about land and governance, and we really dig into it and what's our values about land and stuff. And then we start to talk about, okay, what's our land governance? Who makes decisions about land? It is very rarely that we come back with the elected officials because you don't elect people because they know land. You elect people because they can make shit happen with government, like make government stuff happen and run government, right? And I'm not saying that they don't know land, but that's not why you're electing them. And so they have to be either informed by or directed by or move the decisions to something else that is actually does have a lot of wisdom on land. A lot of times we have a land elders or knowledge keepers or something like that, and it's like a senate or something like that. And when you really get down to more pure models, and if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, in the old days, it's funny because democracy was modeled after uh, the Six Nations Confederacy over in Eastern Canada, the early forms of democracy. And even the earliest forms of democracy did not have like one leader for everything because one leader doesn't know everything. It's, it's about what you know and and how you can look after people.
What do you what do you think will be the stickiest things when you try and make this shift? Where are we going to have the most trouble, changing things?
Uh, I'll tell you what I'm seeing right now is the hardest thing is to get our minds around it and to be able to lead it properly. Um, um, And I'm not saying I could do that any better, frankly. I try to make as much influence as I can, but I don't have all the answers. Um, I think if we don't if we don't facilitate a large scale paradigm shift, we will not be successful at this. How's that? That bottom line. But sometimes paradigm shift, like I'll give you an example. This is a really good one. Uh, Somebody asked me, how do you, what is one big thing that can make a paradigm shift happen? I was talking at this conference the other day. So my answer was COVID. Think about it. All of a sudden now, every one of us has learned to work from home. Most people have started to go, I can have a decent work-life balance. Our whole nature of our economy has changed. Our structure of our communities has changed. Like so many things have changed because that was just pushed on us. Well, we keep going down this path, and the land will push something pretty big on us, and we'll be kind of pushed to it. I'd personally like to hopefully try to get ahead of it a little bit as opposed to behind it and maybe reduce the casualties as we move through it. But I tend to be a rose-colored glasses kind of person. So yeah, you got to be if you do this work.
Um, we had someone ask during registration about the changes that what impact these changes will have on approvals, construction, and maintenance of existing and proposed recreation infrastructure. What's your sense
Um,
with that?
I think once we all learn how to think like this, I'll tell you what I do worry about a little bit is that we don't embrace this properly and we think we can do it through some kind of excessive regulation or something and we bung everything up because that absolutely doesn't achieve it. Um, it's interesting because an old an ecology professor at UBC, Hamish Kimmins, him and I did a lecture together, and he had done a research study internationally on the level of land stewardship, the standard of land care based on a number of land metrics correlated to the level of administrative overhead. And he found that the standard of land care directly drops as the level of administrative overhead goes up. And in fact, as it goes beyond a certain point, it drops exponentially. And that was when we were going into the code. And the highest level was something like, I don't know, I'll say 50%. And the level of land stewardship was pretty darn low. And he said, we're going to 75 with the code. So draw your own math. Um, and so I do worry about that because this is about wisdom and outcomes. Like we're achieving ecological outcomes. Um, and and uh, and so if we do this right, and if we're building it together, we're going to know why we do it, and we're going to have the plans, and we're going to have you can do these things in these areas. Uh, and yes, there may be some conditions on how you do them. Um, but would they be, in my perfect world, it would be moving much more of the thinking and planning to the front end as opposed to trying to figure it all out at the back end and keep adding stuff on and then go, oh, shit, I forgot that, or, and keep on doing that, which frankly drives me crazy when I have to go through processes like that. I like to know up front, okay, these are all the issues. Okay, I'll figure something out that'll work with those. And once I do that, it's good. I much prefer that style of planning myself, and that's what this is really hopefully trying to do.
So it'll be a system where we'll all have a better sense of what's allowed, what's not allowed, what we have to work between, and that's where we'll start our planning from is, okay, here are the parameters, and now you can figure out whether what you want to do will fit in that and how.
Well, and more importantly, probably why. And so this is the outcome we're trying to achieve. This is the kinds of things we think can happen there and still make that. If you have an idea that might work, let's hear it.
Hmm.
and let's look at it. 15 hours. So yes, is kind of the short answer to that with a small subtlety.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time. There's lots more questions that we'd love to get to, but maybe you can leave us off with just some action items. Everybody in this audience loves action items, loves an idea of what they should do next. So, what would you say, like one or two things that a recreation audience can do to sort of prepare themselves for this paradigm shift?
Um, I think the more, as I said, that you can learn about what other jurisdictions are doing and planning around ecosystem health, because we are all learning this right now. And the more that you can learn, the more you can maybe come up with ideas that make sense and make practical sense. Because this is very much a common sense thing, a lot of it, and there's certainly a lot of science in it. Um, I the world's run by those who show up, right? So get involved. Otherwise, you're not showing up. So, and frankly, I know the culture that a component of our community has. Like I'm an outdoor recreationist too, and I got all toys and whatever. Um, I know the attitude some of our community has, and I try to help them learn and grow. And I find it hard to judge them because I mean we are what we are, right? If you can help them to grow, I find converted smokers are the best people to help other people because you know you know how they are, religious almost. They're the best preachers and disciples. Yeah. So um, I, there's a lot of interest out there in getting these messages out. I don't feel like we're doing a really great job of it yet. But I do think myself personally, this is certainly the right approach. I don't think we're getting every single part of it right yet, but this is big and that's to be expected. But get involved, learn how to this ecosystem stuff works, see what other people are doing in this kind of context that is trying to help build more wisdom-based solutions as opposed to kind of just directive-based type stuff. And bring it forward, get involved, because as I said, we are very much learning. And one of the underpinnings of this has been a philosophy of let's learn this together and let's teach each other and let's try to learn from each other. I personally try to be a little bit dogged about making sure that that happens with my work with government and keep reminding them that you don't know everything because they don't, like we don't, nobody does. So maybe that's enough. There's probably more, but I don't know.
All right. Well, yeah, we're almost out of time here, so let's leave it there.
Yeah.
Um, I'm just going to switch over here and just to conclude. Um, First of all, Garry, thanks so much for sharing your experience, your knowledge today, and thanks for everyone in the audience for joining us. The webinar is part of a monthly series. For March, we'll be talking to some outdoor groups who are practicing reconciliation. We'll have representatives from nonprofit recreation sharing their experiences partnering and supporting First Nations. The best way to stay up to date on the webinar topics and everything else the Outdoor Recreation Council is doing is by subscribing to the newsletter at orcbc.ca. Quick reminder that we will send out a recording of this webinar later this week. And please stick around for the survey. It's a great place to let us know about anything you wish we'd cover today and any topics you'd like us to tackle in the future. It will load right after I finish talking. So thanks, Garry. Thanks everyone for coming. And I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.